faith. And so the Beyond Christ title obviously represents how Westar has moved beyond that original project to look at the formation of early Christianity, or early Christ movements, early Jesus movements. We're still grappling with what terminology we can use in place of Christianity, because at the very least we have to talk about Christianities, great variety of different groups and movements which grew out of the first Jewish movement around Jesus of Nazareth. And Constantine has always been, in a lot of people's mind, a kind of symbol for that monolithic, unified church with a capital C, the beginnings of that. Constantine gets varying degrees of credit for that, most of it unfairly, and I'm not sure unfairly is the right word. He gets credited with a lot of things he had nothing to do with, and he gets blamed for a lot of things he had nothing to do with. But Constantine is a useful symbol because he represents a major transition in Christian history, where at least for some of these Christ groups, legalization allows them to start to form public open institutions, whereas before they often had to operate underground. And once they move into that limelight, there's a lot of pressure for them to develop those institutions. And a lot of things that we think of as church with the capital C arise in that early 300s, mid 300s period when Constantine has legalized Christianity and given it the opportunity to build buildings, wear distinctive clothing, in other ways distinguish themselves and mark themselves by that religious identity. Now, the Christianity Seminar started over 5 years ago as an effort to move that story forward from Beyond Christ, heading in the direction of Constantine. And so for the last 5 or 6 years, it's focused primarily on, as you mentioned, the first couple centuries. And in that period, we have very sporadic information, a lot of voices in texts that are floating around, hard to place in location, hard to place in time, a lot of attribution of text to people that we can't be confident about, a lot of texts that have been tinkered with and added to in their transmission since they're originally composed. So we've had our work cut out for us, so we've done a lot. But now we're moving into phase 2, which is to take things into the 200s and into the 300s. And we start to get really distinct figures and personalities and sort of the appearance of distinct Christian groups that we can say a lot about with confidence, about what they stand for, what they take as authoritative in their tradition, how they see the relationship to the world, to the state, to classes in society, and so forth. All along, I think, we've been dealing with the fact that in Westar's work, there has been a kind of subtle Protestant presupposition. And that Protestant presupposition sort of pits a symbol like Constantine against a symbol like Christ. With the idea that if we get back to the earliest, if we get back to the beginnings, that's good. And as time goes on, things get bad. And so a big part of our task is not only to deconstruct this idea of a unified early church, but also this dichotomy of early equals good and later equals bad. Like any religious community, the Christ movements are developing, they're confronting new situations, new challenges, they're exploring deeper some of their basic ideas and concepts and values, and they're shaping themselves to the needs of people and to the needs of the times. And so we want to make sure that people understand that all of this is sort of a natural religious process, and it's perfectly all right to assess individual choices in terms of their pros and cons, but we should get over the idea that the earlier we get, the better form of Christianity we get. It's all part of an elaborate and complex historical story. Now I see that Lillian has joined us.
Yes.
Perfect timing.
Finally, sorry.
Yes. Hey, no, I'm glad to have you. So if you didn't pick up on the tone of the initial question that I had kind of kicked it off with, was both giving you both an opportunity to talk a little bit about the second phase of the Christianity Seminar, or maybe also hitting on a little bit about what the Christianity Seminar is in general. And then also addressing this idea that for me comes to mind most readily when I think of the work that you all do, and how illuminating it has been for me to think of not this one monolith of the early church, but how many movements and Christianities there were at that time. And so, Lillian, I'd be interested to hear your contribution to that conversation as well.
Sure. So my work is actually at the later end of this period, but I'm trained as a New Testament scholar, and so I'm one of these odd folks that straddles both ends of this spectrum. But the more I work with the late antique texts that I work on, which are post-Constantine, and so you saw the little "and after Constantine," which I added to Jason's title. The more I work with those texts, I find myself increasingly convinced that we can't really understand the early period until we look at this later period, because in fact, all the records that we have of the early period are coming from this later period. And Jason talked about the imprint of Protestantism. And one of the legacies of Protestantism is basically to excise monasticism from the story. And in fact, everything we have that is, early Christian in origin, I would argue comes via the monasteries. So if we take the monasteries out of the pictures, or much of what we have, I saw Jason look, much of what we have from this early period, in fact, is coming from the 3rd and the 4th and the 5th centuries. And as a result, if we take the monasteries out of the picture, we can never get a complete picture. And so part of the Protestant push to go back to origins, I would argue, was in fact an anti-Roman impulse at the point of the Protestant Reformation to kind of rewrite history so that one could take out the Roman Catholic Church and still have a coherent story. And that Roman Catholic Church, for much of its history, was preserved in the documents that we have coming to us from monastic archives and sites. So it's fascinating to then think about and I think the work of this next phase of the seminar is in fact to think about what difference does it make if we look at that whole picture and in fact use this later period as the lens for rethinking what might be happening at that early stage, and what we can never know because we're getting it third or fourth hand. So it's exciting. It's exciting to, in my scholarship, I've been doing this for a very long time, almost in isolation. Jason, I think maybe you feel that way too sometimes. And so it's actually quite exciting to think about having a group like Westar, which has historically reframed the narrative and reframed the history, tackle this later period and think about what that might look like. So,
yeah, and I'm wondering too, and your comment about working in the later section of that and after period made me think of it, but maybe Jason, you could speak to this too. You alluded, Jason, earlier to the paucity of material and kind of trying to weave everything together. But I'm wondering, as things get later, when does there start to be a little bit more that carries forward and more text, more writing, things that we have come to know now as kind of accepted history? Does that start showing up more in this period? So maybe it's a little bit easier to kind of see some of the things that are happening in these Christ communities, or are we still not at that point yet?
Well, as Lillian suggested, in reality, almost everything we have in terms of complete texts comes from the period after Constantine, when Christians are able to have more institutions like the monasteries where they can produce texts. Everything we have from before Constantine in terms of actual manuscripts are very fragmentary pieces. Even something to sort of pick up on Lillian's point about the importance of these institutions of textual transmission. A good example is the Nag Hammadi text. I think most of the audience is familiar with, and has been published many times in terms of the Gnostic scriptures or the Gnostic Bible and so forth. When in fact, the evidence, I think, is quite clear that these are a selection of texts that were made by monastics, by monks and nuns, who deliberately selected texts that have an ascetic slant to them, that support their values of celibacy and so forth. And that, so of all of that early literature that we were so excited to finally get our hands on, finally, primary Gnostic texts, but a very carefully made selection of those texts that fit a later framework, a later frame of mind of the people who are putting those volumes together. And so it can very much skew the picture of what the earlier period might have looked like in those terms, in terms of the selection. And all that we have of early Christianity that isn't tiny scraps, dug out of the desert, are whatever materials from the early period that people in the later period found useful and valuable and worth copying and worth repeating. And that is something we always have to be cautious about and think about.
Yeah.
Or I think one could argue what survived, which may have been representative or may not. I mean, the accidents of history and all of this are, and Nag Hammadi, I think, is a great example of this. The story of the survival of that corpus, it could have as easily not been found as found, right? And so there is this serendipitous sense of what we know and what we don't know. And then there are mountains of texts that have never been, looked at or reviewed or been available for very good reasons. I have a colleague right now who's been invited to work in some of the monastic libraries. And the reason she's been invited is because she's Coptic and they trust that she won't make off with manuscripts.
Oh, wow.
Very important.
So there's a whole, other history to this of, what's available, what's been accessible. It's complicated, and that makes for, I think, an exciting next phase.
Yeah. I have a technical request, Lillian. Are you on your phone?
I am, because I cannot log into my computer for some reason.
Is it possible to just set your phone on a stack of books or something, just so that it doesn't, if you can't, no worries, but just if you could, I think that would be helpful, but not to sidetrack the conversation.
No.
But so,
I'll work on that.
Oh, thank you. Before we open it up to questions, do either of you have anything else that you'd like to share about the second half of the seminar, or even the first half, or anything from your own work or anything like that before we jump in?
Well, the people should know that that the first phase of the seminar is putting all of its results into a book.
Right.
That's being prepared for a general educated audience, to explain some of the things that we've worked out in our years of work. And this has been a collective process involving many scholars, discussing, debating, meeting in the Westar's public meetings and so forth, to work out just how diverse and how complex the early Christ movements were, and at the same time pulling out certain distinct characteristics of what made it an identity that was shared across group boundaries and between different varieties. So that'll be very exciting, and that will be coming out in probably a couple of years. In the meantime, then, we are starting to organize and look at this next phase. And one way we decided to do that is, again, taking Constantine as kind of symbolic of a dramatic change in Christian fortunes. Contemporary with Constantine was a major Christian writer, Eusebius, who constructed the first history of Christianity. And we're very much tackling that composition first, because that has had a huge influence on how people have thought about Christian history or imagined its formation. And we're basically deconstructing Eusebius and showing how he basically invented a Christian history by selecting things from the past that he thought were most in continuity with what his community and his tradition represented, and sort of casting to the margins other forms of early Christianity that his group was not that continuous with. And so breaking the hold of Eusebius on our idea of the church is something that will be a big first step for what we're about to do.
Right.
And I guess I would add to that, that I don't know that Eusebius maybe consciously created Christianity. Those who came after reading Eusebius and taking him as authoritative, we have many other histories that follow Eusebius, but they're not nearly as well read and are largely part of an alternate tradition. So Eusebius comes down through the West as the authoritative voice and becomes the history of the church. It's hard to know what Eusebius himself intended. And in some ways, one might think of him as something of a Paul. I doubt that Paul had any sense, of how his letters might be read, how those letters might be read. We can't know with Eusebius, but certainly he has had that text has had a huge influence on how the Western church has viewed the rest of history. And so it will be interesting to unpack that and rethink it.
Yeah. So one of the things that I realized I neglected to say at the beginning is framing Westar a little bit more. And I imagine that a lot of folks that are joining us are probably familiar, but I always like to say a little bit about the organization just for people that aren't. And so what we're doing is Westar in a lot of ways. It's taking the scholarship of religion and putting it kind of in the public space. That really is the thing that is intended to fuel what we do. And so we talked about this Christianity seminar. We've had other seminars, perhaps, Jesus seminar being our most well-known seminar, but have had others over the years. These groups of scholars that get together and do research and work together for years often. And as Jason said, there's a book that's coming out from the Christianity seminar. So producing content, that's one way that we disseminate that information, but then also starting to do a lot more with this sort of virtual dissemination and getting as many people involved as possible and being able to dialogue directly with scholars and ask questions. And that's one of the things that is really important to us, is to yes, do good, reliable scholarship, but then it's no good if it stays in the ivory tower, right? So bringing it out, or not no good, but maybe not could be better. So taking it out into folks, and as Jason said, the idea being that the stuff that's written is accessible to a general audience, and the conversations we have are accessible, and those sorts of things. So sometimes I know we do get into a little bit of assumptions around like, oh, we are familiar with this stuff, so people must be. So if that's the case through the course of this conversation, feel free to kind of virtually raise your hand or put it in the chat or whatever, and don't be afraid to ask questions, because we don't want to make assumptions, and I know sometimes, it's inevitable. So with that said, we can certainly open it up to conversation and questions. And what we usually do, just because of the volume of folks, which is wonderful, but we usually just have people, when they've got questions, put it in the chat bar. So there's at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's like a little, dialogue box thing that says chat, and you just click on that, it'll go to everyone, or you can just select me, and if you just want to send it to me, and we can go from there. So you'll have to kind of bear with me, because I'm trying to manage the actual conversation and also manage what we're getting through the chat. So I try to get to as many folks' questions as I can, but obviously I can't necessarily get to everybody depending on how everything goes. So that was a lot of me talking. So if anybody has questions that they'd like to put in there that we can start dialoguing about, or observations. I'm noticing one here that's, I don't know if this is too much a question, it's just kind of an observation, but Nigel says, perhaps better to think of Western and Eastern churches in the period after Constantine, as at least a third of the church east of Jerusalem is almost unknown outside of academia. And Rome comes into being really only after, they say, 1054 CE, when Orthodox and Latin became two distinct entities. So that is more than I know, but an interesting observation. I don't know if either of you have anything to say or any thoughts about that.
Well, I'll just jump in and say that indeed that's a great observation, that there's a huge history of the spread of Christian movements into the Iranian world, into Central Asia, into China. Manichaeism, which is a form of Christianity, goes there. The Church of the East, of course, plays a very big role in Central Asia. It's adopted by a lot of Turkic and Mongol peoples in Central Asia. And then, of course, Africa has a tremendous Christian history, including Christian kingdoms of a variety of different forms of Christianity, not just in Egypt and Ethiopia, but also in what is today Sudan, right up till late medieval times. And so there's a couple good popular books out there about this subject, which I'm not going to be able to think of the author off the top of my head, but indeed, this sort of outside the Roman Empire story is something we've explicitly talked about, something the seminar needs to pay attention to.
And this is actually really part, if I can chime in, this is part of deconstructing Eusebius. Because as I suggested, Eusebius becomes kind of the authoritative document for the West, but in the East, it would have been a much broader conversation. And so hopefully a piece of rethinking Eusebius will be to rethink a much larger landscape and what Christianity really looks like as we move out of a Western context.
I think following on the heels of that, I see a few questions that could kind of tie into that, but one person asks about the range of diversity that was present in these early Christ movements. And I'm wondering if you could, I know there's like the kind of the gender diversity question and, women being marginalized versus not, but I'm wondering if you can speak to any other sorts of ranges of diversity in these movements that may have either been same or similar or different from what would have been seen in the larger cultural context of the day.
That's a great question. And one of the angles that I've used in working on monasticism has been to think about what does it look like to imagine a diverse monastic population. So often I think monasticism gets framed in gets viewed through a Western lens. And yet if we look at monastic sources, of which we have many, we see an incredibly diverse demographic. That wouldn't be true of all monasteries. So there's a diversity of monasteries. But what's fascinating is to see many of the same demographic questions that we see in the proto-Christian texts showing up in later monastic sources. And that suggests that perhaps one of the hallmarks of Christianity was a space where there was a degree of diversity. And that is, I think, is one of the questions that I hope we'll explore in the second phase of the project or the seminar.
There's a great early 3rd century text by a Syrian Christian named Bardizan. And Bardizan is talking about Christians being dispersed all over the world. They're new people, but they have no homeland. And he's trying to emphasize how much, even though they come from very different backgrounds, they share the same values. But you can turn that around as well. A big source of the diversity in early Christianity came from the different backgrounds from which people came into the Christ movements and their expectations and assumptions about things spiritual and religious. And so, again, that Western bias in our work, we tend to think of as the Christ movements as primarily something that starts out Jewish and then is Hellenized and Romanized. But in its spreading to other regions, it was spreading into places where people became Christ followers against a background of Syrian culture or Mesopotamian culture or Iranian culture or Ethiopian culture. And they brought very different expectations and very different emphases to the traditions.
Yeah.
I think likewise, there's also a greater diversity of Judaism in this period than is imagined. And so as Christianity is growing out of Jewish enclaves, that diversity continues. And so we see both and, which makes that a really rich area for continued research.
Yeah, that kind of answers a question I think we got a little bit up here. The kind of a taxonomy of early Christianities. It's you've kind of addressed that a little bit, thinking of it not just as this movement that came from Judaism, but that just to your point of being influenced from all these different places that it emerged, and being a confluence of all those different experiences for folks. So I feel like we kind of got to that one. let's see if I can make a connection to any of these other questions. This is kind of interesting. A question about how Eastern churches differed in terms of like mysticism in their emergence. And I know, you know, from reading some of, especially the non-canonical texts, you get more of that sense of, I think, of the Gospel of Mary, of this more like mystic kind of Jesus figure. So I don't know if you guys have any thoughts around a more mystical form of early Christ movement that emerged that maybe didn't trickle down as much in Western culture.
Well, this gets to Lillian's point that traditions of Jewish mysticism, which in some ways got sort of marginalized by some of the authority structure of rabbinic Judaism as it developed, but clearly there were varieties of Judaism, whether you're thinking of the community of the Dead Sea Scrolls or the people who were, you know, trying to figure out how to ascend to God. And we have lots of material like that. That carried over directly into some forms of the early Christianities. And certainly that mystical bent, I think, Lillian could probably speak to this better than I can, is something that did maintain a stronger presence in the Eastern traditions than the Western.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also hard to know, however, how much of that could be latent Orientalism as well, and a sense of the exotic East and the you know, rational West. I think there's a spectrum in both ends of that, you know, that conversation, and I think when one begins, if one, you know, kind of moves the center of the map from the West into Central Eurasia or the Middle East, which is where it would have been in the ancient world, the rich mix of influences are I think almost impossible to parse, and one has to begin to think of a much more complex conversation that, you know, may have involved a range of religious traditions. And we, you know, we've spent a lot of time studying Judaism and you know, the movement from Judaism to Christianity, which is perhaps the most obvious, or Zoroastrianism. But, you know, once we get into Central Asia, it's not hard to imagine, certainly during the monastic period, and we have records of, you know, Buddhist and Christian monks. And we have records in Alexandria of the Theosophists, you know, who are probably coming up from India. So if we start to look at a much more complicated picture than what we get in Eusebius, to kind of bring this back around, it's fascinating to think about what those early communities look like and what they still look like today. There is still a strong community of Christians in southern India, and their traditions probably don't look like you know, what one might expect elsewhere. So I think it is really thinking about how do those later developments help us think about that early community in more complex terms as well.
So I don't know if anyone else is noticing this, but I'm noticing John, looks like John Moore is screen sharing. I'm guessing inadvertently, and I keep having to unscreen share. So John, if you could just be mindful of what button you might accidentally be pushing that's making that happen, that would be great. Okay, so back to questions. Well, this one is, I think, as you've addressed a little bit, but maybe more explicitly, a question about what scriptures would have been part of an early Christian Bible and which not, which there wasn't really such a thing. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, again, to those pieces of this community here, that community there, like what texts would have been emerging and important for them, maybe if you have, you know, kind of anything to say about that.
I'm actually going to be speaking on this in Santa Rosa in our spring.
Great.
So I'll just say a few things. The first thing we have to step back from is the idea that early Christians were primarily a textual tradition, and the first thing they thought about was a Bible. The more and more we look at the evidence, the more and more it seems that a lot of Christians got along just fine without a Bible. And of course, it took a very long time for the canon as we know it today to come into existence. So we have to stop, you know, scriptures is a very special sort of category that the Judeo-Christian tradition has kind of created. And we have to sort of dig ourselves out of anachronism and think what people in the ancient world would have been talking about that would be equivalent to what we call scriptures, right? And so, people often look at the Greek world and they talk about classics. What is a classic? What is this text meant to be? Is it meant to model a particular narrative? Is it meant to model a particular literary style? Is it meant to be a sort of cultural touchstone? Or even what early Jews were thinking they were doing with the quote unquote scriptures when they met in synagogues? Were they thinking this is primarily as a religious text or as a collection of cultural materials? Some of the contents of the Tanakh would suggest that indeed this was thought to be a collection of important cultural milestones of Jewish tradition more than a book of religious instruction. So Christians had a lot of different ways of thinking about scripture or Bible or canon. And some groups, like Marcionites, might have been moving faster to kind of formalize a collection of scripture. And other Christians, frankly, were resistant to that idea and said, what's your hurry? What's so important here? What might you be trying to take authority away from, say, leadership in the community, the sort of oral transmission of traditions from head of the community to the next head of the community and so forth. There were battles about the form in which authority would take, and resting authority on a text was not an automatic or inevitable choice that was being made.
I think I would add to that. I have thought a little bit about canon of late because I work on monastic school texts, and one of the ways we define canon in the classical world and in the Greco-Roman world is what shows up in the classroom, and in some ways we might still define canon that way today. And so it's fascinating. Christina Rusland and I, who presented at our last Westar seminar at the AAR SBL this fall, has kind of given a loose definition of canon in terms of what gets used. And it's interesting to think of classroom texts in that light. And there's a distinct corpus. And so I can say that, there are a certain body of text from Hebrews, what we would call today Hebrew scripture, that are used again and again and again in a classroom setting. Paul gets a lot of mileage by late antiquity. And I've wondered how much of Paul's importance in the tradition is a function of the fact that Pachomius says, when you come into the monastery, give them the letters of Paul. And so it's interesting to think about how canon is formed. And I agree with you, Jason, that canon just can mean so many different things, but it's been fun to play with this idea, actually, since our meeting this fall, in thinking about, if we imagine canon as what gets taught, and that there's kind of a reflection as to learning to read what you need to read, or what you need to recite, or what you need to pray. Interesting to see what shows up in the canonical corpus in that way. But then there's a much broader definition that looks relatively fluid for a very long time, and still is. I mean, the Eastern Church still uses a different canon to some degree than the Western Church. And so.
And I'm wondering too, there's been a few questions about canon and influence and that sort of thing. So one question specifically about influence from maybe even pagan culture. Obviously that would have been a piece of it. So influence from, you talked some about Judaism, but yeah, like what were some of the places, the experiences and the other texts and traditions that were influencing the development of what came to be known as canon, I guess I would say.
Yeah, Lillian is exactly right, that for the pre-Christian sort of Hellenized world, the classroom was where these questions of texts were addressed. And if you're talking about a religious context, say, to use the expression, a pagan temple, texts were not really a significant part of it. There might have been stories that certain people who worked for the temple knew and would recite to pilgrims and things like that. Sometimes these things were written down, sometimes they were inscribed, but very often not. And so texts were really not an integral part of most religious practice in the ancient world. And so again, we have to sort of dig our way out of anachronism and not automatically think that a religious community goes along with the text, because in the Greco-Roman world, certainly that was not the case.
And then I think I would add to that, that as we move into the Christian period, which monasticism, I think one could argue is some expression of Christianity, or some diverse expression of Christianity, we see a liturgy forming. And it's clear that there's a relationship between what shows up in the liturgy and what becomes canon. And so that's another really interesting angle. Derek Kruger has done a lot of work on thinking about the interface between liturgy and classroom liturgy and canon. And so that makes for a multifaceted kind of formation that looks maybe quite different from the models that we've inherited up to this point.
Interesting. I think there was a question back up here that maybe we've already covered, but I just want to see if I missed it. What value do you put on second century writings of folks like Ignatius, Clement, Justin Martyr, etc.? Sort of, I guess, in the same sort of influential vein.
Well, there's kind of an elephant in the room when it comes to all those texts that most scholars don't even want to touch, which is that our manuscripts of these people are all very, very late, like 1,000 years later. And so the real question is, how reliable is what we have in terms of what they wrote at the time? There's all kinds of problems with Justin Martyr's texts in terms of apparent anachronisms, especially in some of his larger works. And Ignatius is all but dissolving before our eyes, as in terms of the integrity of his group of letters. The selection of letters that have been often talked about as more or less authentic are simply extracted from manuscripts that have all kinds of clearly fraudulent letters of Ignatius right next to them. So it's a very subjective selection that's being made of things that could possibly pass as really second century compared to the letter right next to it, which clearly is full of anachronisms. So Ignatius is a particularly difficult example of something that we really can't be all that sure that what we have reflects the second century world that they're speaking from. So this is a very difficult issue for all of us to tackle.
Lillian, anything to add?
I think I would simply add that it's also what has survived, and I don't know, what I tell my students is there are fingerprints all over these texts. Someone made choices all the way along as to what to privilege and what to discount, and how representative any corpus of material might really be is a live question, which makes it quite interesting to think about, why particular texts stayed in use and why others didn't. So I think, another version of what I said up to this point.
Right.
Or what Jason has said as well.
This might be a repeat too, but might be helpful for folks that aren't familiar with some of these, councils and controversies and that sort of thing. But a question about, did some of these controversies and different ways of understanding canon or whatever, for lack of a better word, in these communities play a part in some of the things that then came later? The specific question here is around the Arian controversy, but others that arise as well.
I think so. That, once something gets deemed heretical, it sees people don't copy it anymore. Right. And so if we think of what keeps a text alive is use, then being placed in another category means it's less likely to be used in a common thread. And so it's fascinating to think about what might not have survived. And this is what makes the Nag Hammadi codices so interesting, because it gives us just a glimpse of a corpus of material that didn't remain in use, but in fact captures a very, very different picture from the texts that are more familiar. And that is interesting in its own right, but it also suggests that maybe there are that many other corpora that, you know, fell out of use for a variety of reasons, that would give us yet another picture and yet another picture and yet another picture.
Right. Right.
Yeah, there's a good example of Eusebius actually refers to a lot of texts we don't have. And so our picture of the 2nd century, as Lillian just said, is skewed by what happens to survive. And otherwise, Eusebius refers to a vast body of literature that might have completely changed how we sort of see all these things going together. And a real challenge for our work coming up here is that one of the big giants of the 3rd century, perhaps the intellectual giant of the 3rd century, Origen, was one of these people who later got declared heretical. And so his works are a mess in terms of our access to them. Sometimes, you know, we have bits and scraps of them. Sometimes we have versions of them that have been cleaned up to fix them from heresy, you know, as defined by the later church or later church authorities. And so even to get back to the historical origin is a challenge.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting, even in the school texts, there are, you know, places where it says, don't read these texts. So even at, you know, in elementary education, there's instruction of don't, you know, it's okay to read these. And this might be one of the places where we get some sense of canon. It's okay to read these, but it's not okay to read those. But then we can imagine that in a different school, that list might be different, right? And so then there's also the question of, you know, the fact that Jerome and Rufinus survive and become part of Western conversation, has in turn shaped, you know, what comes after. So it's a really big puzzle, and that will be the challenge and the fun of the next phase, if we can put out a little teaser there.
Yeah, for sure. I'm trying to think of how to kind of work these two together, but if you could give some examples or just talk a little bit about some of those differences that you were alluding to earlier between even today, some of the canons, versions of canons that we have, East versus West, Catholic Church versus Protestant Church versus, you know, these sorts of different ways that even today things are still not completely uniform, often in the way I think people might assume that they could be or would be.
Well, we could start. I mean, I know more about the New Testament canon, but the Ethiopian church is a much larger canon than any other church, so it includes many other books. But it's also true that we have evidence of a lot of flux in the early canon when people were trying to put together single volume codices of the Bible, which is a major undertaking, requires major resources. It's not a very handy book to make in pre-printing. You got to lug this thing around. But you know, things like there were several additional books included in the New Testament that later were taken out. And frankly, we wish we knew more about these processes and these decisions, because these are not the kinds of things that councils usually took up and addressed. I think popular conception is that canon was settled at councils. It's almost never addressed at councils. It's always individual bishops, individual places sending out, you know, authoritative letters and things like that, governing their own area. In the Syrian Christian world, a harmony of the Gospels, combining the Jesus narrative into a single narrative, was until around 500 was the main form in which people knew the Jesus story. They didn't know the 4 separate Gospels really. And it took, you know, again, authorities of one particular kind of Christianity, the one that had state support, to come in and say, now let's gather up all those manuscripts of that harmonized gospel, destroy those, and replace it with the 4-fold gospel. And then, of course, they had to acclimate and get people used to dealing with the fact that this is 4 different gospels rather than one single gospel account. And that took a lot of work and a lot of ingenuity to make people accept that, despite all the problems that of course, has caused for Christians ever since, in terms of these stories don't always agree. So there's a lot of little stories like that that are a fun part of the picture.
I think in addition, I think one of the ways that when I teach this to students, I suggest one of the ways we can know what was still in vogue is by reading the Quran. So many of the stories that are not in the Christian canon, in fact, show up in the Quran, and that suggests they were still in use, they were still being told, and they were still part of the conversation, even though, you know, when we read them now, they seem very strange, but they're woven into the Quranic text in a way that suggests they were very much a part of the conversation at that point. And that really shifts, I think, the question of canon in terms of, and just frames it in a very different way as a function of use rather than, or where use is of equal status as perhaps attributed authority. And then, you know, the fact is the winners do write history. And so it's interesting to think backwards, and this is some of the work that we can do in monasticism as well, to think backwards of, you know, if these things are still in use in the 4th and 5th and 6th and 7th centuries, how do we begin to rethink what we think about as authoritative text in the earlier periods?
I just thought of another example based on what Lillian was saying about use, and that is well into the medieval period in the Catholic and Orthodox churches, when a theologian is writing a text, they might cite various books of the Bible. But an interesting case is the book of Revelation, which often is not in codices. It's not in biblical codices,
Right.
even though it's cited and referred to in other works. And the reason it's not in those codices is it's not used in the liturgy. The book of Revelation is not read from in the church service, and therefore there was no reason to include it in a codex that was primarily there as the work in the church that would be opened and read from. And so there's canon, and then there's canon.
Yeah.
And then there's canon.
Yeah, very interesting. So I kind of saved a couple of application-y type questions for the last two that we'll probably get to. So the first one is curious about what all this diversity that we're talking about sort of from this early period could mean, or what impact could it have on what our evolving theology is today. Seeing the diversity from so long ago, and maybe that desire oftentimes we were talking about at the beginning to think that everything at the beginning was better and to go back to there, but when we try to go back to there more faithfully, we look at just the immense diversity that existed, and then thinking about what that could mean for us today and how that might shift some of our assumptions is the way that I conceive of it. So I'm interested to hear what you all think as well.
You want to take a crack at that, Lillian?
Well, I can, what I say to my students more and more, and what I believe more and more, is that we have the privilege of eavesdropping on a very long conversation that sounds incredibly familiar. And I thought this so much as we were listening to the Me Too movement and reading the Gospel of Mary and watching Hillary Clinton, you know, stake out space, right? And I think, and so I don't think we find answers in the ancient texts. I think we find conversation partners, and we get to see what the outcome is. So we can see the outcome of excluding women from the conversation. We can see the outcome of, and then we can make a decision ourselves of whether we still want to do that. We can see the outcome of reducing kind of multifaceted communities to a single story, right? And the richness that is lost as a result. And then we can think for ourselves whether that's still a good strategy moving forward. And so I find myself more and more simply intrigued by the degree to which, and not to map ourselves onto the ancient world, but by the degree to which the human experience remains common, with all the differences that we must acknowledge, but that there are these kind of existential questions that we continue to wrestle with. And I know I feel this often in the monastic sources, that what we have in the monastic sources is a microcosm of life, and it's documented. And so we have this incredible privilege of being able to kind of read around a conversation and realize that, you know, there were as many opinions in the ancient world about how much wine one should drink as there are in the contemporary world. And then begin to think about how those you know, decisions were made at that point, and how we might learn from that in addressing our own stories, our own moment.
And building on that, I would just say that I think it's an important first step just for people to realize that things have not always been the way they are. And it's true of any religion that it's part of its self-identity and myth to claim to represent the tradition as it always has been and always should be. And it's important liberation from that authority to say, it hasn't always been this way. There's a history behind it. And the history is a series of forks in the road. And some of the choices that Lillian was referring to that were made in the past were made under specific circumstances. And we can try to understand what those circumstances were and what it is that people thought served them in the choices that were made. But those choices that served those people at those times do not necessarily best serve us in our time. And therefore, it's helpful not to have to think up everything again from scratch, but to go back into the past and see how other people, representative of the same tradition, thought were possible alternatives that might somehow be timely again, for the very reasons Lillian said, that there's these continuities in the human condition that make these questions come round and round. And it may be that I'm always, as a historian, always fighting for the case that ancient people were just as smart as us and in some ways smarter. And there's a lot of resources there that we could use in our impoverished modern age.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for wonderful insights as always. I noticed one question down here that I didn't want to slip through. We don't necessarily have to answer it. I just wanted to put a pin in it. What was the importance of women in the early church conspicuously excluded by church leadership? I think the short answer is yes. But I also want to direct folks that are curious about that to the Westar website, because we have done lots of scholarship around that and books and wonderful resources. But we've also done some conversations like this with some of our great scholars on that subject. And Ali Katouche is a wonderful resource. She's a Westar scholar as well. And we've done a conversation with her. And she's also going to be speaking at the spring meeting. And she does some really interesting stuff with the way that women were excluded from ancient art. And that being kind of a cipher for the general ways that women were excluded. So again, short answer, yes, but there's lots more resources. So we don't necessarily have to tackle it here. I just wanted to not let it slip by. So with that, any closing things that Jason or Lillian, you all would like to say as we wrap up?
I would just urge as many of you as can to come to the spring meeting and see us in action, see how it's done. Bring your questions and comments to the conversation. It's a very good forum for the meeting of minds that we do, and it's open to you if you'd like to come and be a part of it, and I hope you will.
And I would say thank you for joining us this evening. I've not really done this before. You probably could tell. And it's quite fun to have a conversation, if virtually, but it would be more fun to have that conversation in person. So yes, do join us.
Yes, spring meeting is, we do live streaming of the sessions, but unfortunately, because of logistical constraints, we can't typically live stream the seminar meetings where all the scholars get together and hash out and talk and present papers and do a lot of this actual work. So that is definitely the plug and the benefit of being there in person, if you can, but otherwise the actual lectures and the sessions from the speakers will be live streamed. And I will, as I usually do, tomorrow, or honestly probably the next day, I'll send out the link to rewatch this or to share it with folks, or anyone that may have missed it, as well as some of the resources that we've talked about. So I'll include spring meeting resources there and more information about that. And then lastly, I'm putting this in the chat and I will also include it in the email, but just a little plug for membership. So if this is meaningful and interesting to you and you're not already officially a part of Westar as a member, then of course we encourage you to do that. And we have options starting as low as $5 a month. So, and the perks that come with that, we do more of this type of thing in smaller groups, more of like one-on-one conversation options with scholars and those sorts of things, as well as other membership perks as well. So that's kind of the closing spiel, but thank you, Jason and Lillian, for being with us. And thanks everybody for tuning in and for your questions. I think we were able to get to most of them. Sorry if we weren't able to get to yours, but we always continue these conversations offline and in the emails and in upcoming roundtables. So stay tuned. Thanks everybody and have a good night.
Thank you, Alexis.
Thanks, take care.